As you've probably kind of noticed as you were preparing for this, your own communications, that this is a broad topic, and we could approach it through many lenses, from many angles. The notion of metanoia gives rise to lots of conceptual questions. We might ask, does it properly describe an act that a person performs, or is it rather better described as an experience that a person receives? Does metanoia constitute a return to some sort of original, authentic state? Or is it better to speak of it in terms of some sort of rebirth into a new identity? Does it occur in a single moment, or does it span out gradually over time? Does it happen alone or in company? So a number of these questions and others are going to be raised during this day, and I thought maybe instead of giving a kind of whistle-stop tour of the intellectual history of this notion, or being a bit too general, I thought I'd just plunge into one question we might ask. And so the question I'd like to start with is, does metanoia happen at all? And the answer I'm going to present here, very briefly, with which you may disagree, and that might give us some grist for the day. Well, the answer that I have is yes, but not necessarily in the way that we expect it to, or the way that we wish it to. So Pierre Hadot held that, and I quote, "The idea of conversion represents one of the constitutive notions of Western consciousness and conscience. In effect, one can represent the whole history of the West as a ceaseless effort at renewal by perfecting the techniques of conversion, which is to say the techniques intended to transform human reality." So we can interrogate whether or not that observation is correct or incorrect, but let's hold on to it for the sake of argument. It sounds like an argument in favor of metanoia as something real, something concrete, something that happens. But we should be attentive to a tension in that account. We find that elsewhere as well. So in the first instance, in that quote, what do we hear? We hear that the pursuit of personal transformation is constitutive of who we are as Western people. But on the other hand, we also hear that the history of the West is driven by a search to perfect the techniques of conversion, to perfect those techniques, and further, that those techniques, ever being perfected, are intended to transform humanity. Well, what are we to conclude about the efforts of our predecessors if each of their successive techniques required further perfection? And how should we judge the fruits of their conversions if we have sought and continue to seek, generation after generation, to find better means of transforming the human reality which we inherit? Did their conversions not affect any such transformation? Now, on the one hand, one might be tempted to take a sort of Whiggish view and think of conversion as a technology, kind of like powered flight. On that view, the history of innovation in the realm of metanoia attests to our objective progress over time. Our predecessors had rudimentary means of conversion, just like they had rudimentary means of flight. And just as you would rather cross the Atlantic in an Airbus than a Sopwith camel, you'd rather entrust your ethos to modern techniques than to ancient ones. Now, I won't develop too much on this now, but I don't find that notion convincing. On the other hand, one might suppose that although the idea of conversion is constitutive of Western consciousness, the fact of conversion was almost entirely absent from the course of Western history. Metanoia on this view is something like alchemy. It offers an enticing prize, but one that is probably unattainable regardless of the technique employed. Now, admittedly, that would be a rather pessimistic note on which to start our symposium. So here's a third solution to this puzzle. And this is the one I'm going to argue very briefly for. You may or may not agree, but this is one way that we might answer this problem of this reiterative struggle of conversion. Maybe there's a distinction to be made between a certain ideal of metanoia accomplished, which we idealize, and the experience of what we might call metanoia interrupted, which we can actually obtain. And maybe by force of habit, when we elevate that ideal of accomplished complete metanoia, we end up diminishing the real experience, perhaps even to the extent that we end up doubting its reality and that we fail to obtain its promises. Consider just one example. The following passage from Adam Ellwanger's book on this subject, on metanoia, in rhetoric and in Christian religion, in which he discusses the dynamics of conversion, repentance, authenticity, and renewal. And so he writes this. He says, there seems to be some indeterminacy as to the movement of metanoia. Metanoia marks a change or a turning, but is it changing or turning away from something, or is it changing or turning to something? Is it a 360-degree turn, where one returns to a prior state of what was lost, or is it a 180-degree turn, where the subject, in an act of self-negation, turns away from one mode of being and is born again as a person with an entirely new ethos? So my concern with this sort of account is that regardless of where you stand, whether you opt for the 360-degree turn, the 180-degree turn, my problem is that those neatly rounded geometric shapes convey the idea that metanoia constitutes an act that can be perfectly accomplished, such that at some point in the person's life, whether suddenly or gradually, whether by will or by grace, the turn is complete. The person is converted like a mountain is ascended and then marked with a cheerful banner. From that point, any additional events in the person's life are supplemental materials which serve only to confirm the validity of the metanoia accomplished. Now, this idea was long sustained in the popular imagination by an unfortunate type of hagiographic literature that represents the saints as people whose beings were so completely transformed by their metanoic experiences that once converted, they appear as ethereal as angels and as static as totems. However, if we actually interrogate the lives of the saints, we find, of course, that they continue to struggle and to falter until the very end. Does that then mean that their conversion was illusory or fabricated? No, simply that it was not perfect in the sense of being fully accomplished. A seminal example of this, without anticipating Kate Cooper's talk, is Augustine's gradual realization that his conversion to Christianity did not equate to achieving the life proposed in the Sermon on the Mount. And it's noteworthy that Augustine also understood that this realization of the incompleteness of his conversion was itself a deepening of his conversion. And I think that points to something essential about the phenomenon of metanoia, which is that its course is coextensive with a person's natural life. And as such, it's never accomplished, but it's always interrupted at the caesura of death. And yet, by the same token, it's also motivated and oriented by our awareness of this impending interruption. This incomplete quality of metanoia isn't always obvious when we focus on towering figures of virtue who seem so outwardly accomplished in their lives. But we see it more clearly in stories of people whose ethos is visibly in gestation or whose lives were cut short at a relatively early stage of their conversion. And here I'm going to give an example which may be slightly surprising. In a way, it surprised me, but it kind of forced itself upon me, which was the example of Bobby Kennedy. In his book, Coming Apart, this is William L. O'Neill's book, which he wrote just in I think 1971, so 3 years after Bobby Kennedy's death. In that book, William O'Neill supposed that, in retrospect, Bobby Kennedy's foremost quality, I'm quoting here, that Bobby Kennedy's foremost quality will seem to have been his capacity for growth. After his older brother's assassination in 1963, Bobby's character mellowed and deepened. His sympathy for distressed minorities became stronger. He struggled with great questions of life and death. He exchanged instrumental optimism for more stoical philosophy. And I think Bobby's example is particularly instructive because his story is one of metanoia initiated by death, his brother's, and then interrupted by death, his own. And we see this in his place, in the place he occupies in the public imaginary, which is not at all defined by his early achievements, but is defined by what we might call the ellipses left behind at the moment of his assassination. That moment where he appeared to be in the process of personal transformation, where his own personal transformation was mirrored in his campaign platform for the Democratic primary, and his transformation, which also seemed to correspond to a historical moment when, and I'm quoting Sasha here, the possibility for major transformation was palpable, although its direction and the drivers remained uncertain. And on June 6th, 1986, those three converging trajectories, the sense of transformation in the man, in the idea, and in the nation, were pregnant with possibility, and then abruptly were cut short in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Now that might seem like an unexpected point of departure for our day devoted to metanoia. Death is precisely the termination of change and the point at which the person's ethos is as though fixed in amber. In Dante's Inferno, the torments are tailored to the sinner's earthly lives and they repeat themselves for eternity. But as Bobby Kennedy's example illustrates, death also establishes the kairos for metanoia, and it inspires an associated sense of urgency. Any metanoic movement is set against this horizon of temporal finitude, this horizon which motivates, orients, and ultimately interrupts all trajectories of personal transformation. So in summary, I think this is just worth, maybe you agree, maybe you don't, we can discuss. But I think this idea is worth keeping in mind throughout today, not out of morbidity, but out of a certain sense of realism. That metanoia is not a technology that we perfect, it's not a magical incantation, it's an appropriate response to our mortal condition. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing all the discussions today.